Welcome back to the HRE 4M audio series. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 9. So, again, Chapter 9 is just the last chapter in Unit 3. Uh, this one, and when I say this one, I mean this chapter, um, it says Living in Praise and Thanksgiving, which is kind of the title of the chapter. And really, just a quick overview, it really tries to take what was discussed. I believe in chapter 5, when Jesus introduces the Beatitudes and we start to unpack the ethics and the moral implications of the Beatitudes, we now bring that kind of full circle here in this chapter with the idea that there is a quote unquote a gospel dimension of the good life. Now, I'm not saying that for people who are not, again, not Catholic Christians, um, who may have a belief in other faiths or whatever, does not mean that they don't have a similar um, ethical and moral value system in place via whatever teachings come from their faith. Okay. Um, Again, this is kind of, again, we're back to looking through that lens of Catholic Christianity when we talk about that good and happy life. Okay. And again, we go back to the Beatitudes and what the Beatitudes really kind of give to us. Um, and, you know, the Beatitudes, you can access them anywhere through this course of the text, online, etc. Okay. Um, Depending on the gospel writer, the Beatitudes tend to address people in different stages of their lives or different walks of life because they were written for different groups of people. But when we look at the Beatitudes from a global Catholic Christian perspective, um, we start to recognize that from the Beatitudes ethically that we're called to recognize that all is God's gift. Everything has been given to us by God. It's a gift from God for us to use and coexist with and deal with in a peaceful way. So every other human being on the planet is a gift from God. And we're called to, respond. Like I said in chapter 8, we've got norms, laws, rules, and obligations that um, create a dynamic for how we deal with every other human being from a moral norm standpoint. Um, we are called to repent and believe the good news. Um, that's an oversimplification in terms of the sense that we recognize we all make mistakes and that mistakes require forgiveness for us to fully, embrace God's love, but embrace that love for one another. If we can't forgive someone, we can't fully love that person, at least the way we are called to, or the way we could fully invest ourselves in loving that other person if we can't forgive that person. Nor can't be fully loved as individuals if we can't be forgiven for our mistakes as well. Okay? Um, we are called to live a life of praise and thanksgiving. This is not to say that, and this is, I think this is can can be kind of confusing for people in the sense that um, everything's going to be sunshine and roses. That's not a lived reality. However, we should recognize that despite our struggles, and those struggles may be as a result of our mistakes, those struggles may be a result of other people's actions that we have no control over, and it may not make us, the happiest, or we may not be dealing, have to deal with situations we really love. But we should always recognize that there are things in life to be grateful for and thankful for. No matter how bad things get in certain areas, there's always parts of our lives that we can be grateful for and thankful for. And recognizing or remembering that or reminding ourselves of that gives us the ability, reinforces those moral norms to act well and wisely, um, to see that life is not as bad as we think it is, or as bad as we make it out to be, from the lens of being emotional with an experience, etc. All right. Um, That's not to say that life can't get very tough, get very difficult, and it can be sometimes it'll be overwhelming. It can be very frustrating, and it's not a simple fix just to go, well, the world's a wonderful place, no matter how crappy your life gets, and if you can hold on to that, things will be great. That in the moment is kind of that can be hard for anybody to hear in the moment if they're having a really bad day, a bad week, bad month, bad year. But it's a process for you to recognize that things um, really aren't, can get better. That we can see some positivity somewhere and hold on to that and have it strengthen us to get through the difficult times. Okay. And that last kind of overarching ethic is we're called to live generously. Um, Giving is kind of a funny thing when you look at it in society, in the sense that a lot of people equate giving with financial giving. Um, Giving is giving of one's time, of oneself, of simply being there. That is giving. And there's something that I think people we miss out on. It goes back to that living a life of praise and thanksgiving, is recognizing that um, you may not be the most rich person financially. That doesn't mean that you can't give of yourself in other ways. Being there for somebody in a time of need, that's a form of living generously, giving of yourself. Um, Taking the time to talk somebody through a problem, that's giving generously. Um, and that goes along with volunteering your time to do things, etc. That's living generously as well too. It's that ability to give of oneself what one is capable of giving to someone else in need, um, to the best of your ability. I'm not saying you're not always going to be able to meet that person's needs or give them exactly what they want, but you still have something to give. Um, that kind of then moves into, you're looking through the chapter, it moves into this idea of charity, which the text calls it living the love of God. Um, Again, it really goes back to what I just said about living generously, giving of oneself. And it could be as simple as saying good morning to somebody, or making sure that when you end conversations or dealings with people, you hope people have a good day. Sometimes that's all it can take to turn somebody's day from being to being better. Okay. Um, which then kind of moves into what the textbook, the next subheading is, it's walking the road of love, or Christian spirituality. Now we get into this idea of the text is going to then talk about vocations. And really the bulk of the text, towards the end of the chapter, is about vocations. And vocations are a vocation, not a vacation, but a vocation, is a calling for what one does with one's life, not just a job. Secular definitions of the word vocation have focused on your job. So vocational training is training for someone's work. From a moral and a Catholic Christian perspective, we're talking about what you do with your life. And that vocation can take on, you may be single the rest of your life, because that's the calling you feel you're called to, is to be single. Some other people may embrace that calling of being married. The next vocation may be being married and having a family. Those are all various vocations for living. Within those vocations, it may extend to the fact that you are very active within your church community. That's a form of vocation. Another form of vocation is that you're not very active within your church community. Again, these are not it's not about rating. It's not about a good or bad system or saying that one's better than another or one's this, that, or the other thing. It's about recognizing that each of us is called to discern what we are being called to in our lives, not just called to work. So in my case, it's not just being called to be a teacher, it's that call to be a husband, a father, um, you know, a coach, an instructor, churchgoer, etc. And that's just, again, I'm using my own life as an example. So don't read anything into that. It's not meant to be a role model esque for anybody else. It's just I'm using my own life as an example of what the text is going to talk about um, within this idea of Christian spirituality and this vocation of love. Now, when we talk about a vocation of love, the text is very much going to point towards um, things you do either within your family or your church community or the wider community that, again, kind of moves back towards that idea of charity. And I think what people tend to overlook is that um, every one of us every day does something, even within our own families, that to one degree or another tends to be or can be looked upon as charitable in the sense that you're trying to help someone out. It could be as simple as um, giving your younger brother or sister or sibling a ride somewhere, picking up your parents from somewhere, or picking something up for your parents, or running an errand for them. Even if you're being asked to do it, um, the charity part of it comes with the fact that you do it without grumbling or complaining. You go ahead and do it. That's that's where I think people tend to miss the happiness that in the good part of their lives, in the fact that they have you have the ability to do it, you can do it, and that you do it without creating a stink about it, if you will, to one degree or another, which um, I know that can take various forms and whatnot, um, but it's to recognize that it's the little things that each of us does every day that if we were to recognize that it's charitable, not to pat ourselves on the back or to stand up at some point and go, look what I've done, but to recognize that we are, as individuals, making an impact in someone else's lives. And that impact, it's not about measuring the impact's greatness or quote unquote smallness, etc., but recognizing that we are doing something. And I think um, it would benefit humanity as a whole when people start to realize that um, when people really are committed to their life's vocation, they tend to be happier. They tend to be people who feel like they're living a good life. No matter what the ups and downs are, it's a good life. They're happy with it. And that's because I think they have those people, and I know I'm talking kind of abstractly here, but those people have the ability to kind of look at themselves and go, okay, yeah, well, you know what? I'm doing the best that I can here. I'm giving as much as I can here of myself or my time or my money, etc., whatever. And it's not a competition or having to say, well, in comparison to, and this is the funny thing about this unit and these chapters. It's not about comparing yourself to anybody else. It's not about being held up and being quote unquote judged or looked at and saying, well, you've done this, you haven't done that, or you haven't done that, and the other person's done this. And it's this balancing of scales. It's not that at all. It's it really comes back to the fact that we as human beings need to recognize that we give of ourselves, and we give as much as we can. And that's when we need to take solace and strength and happiness from the fact that we are doing our best to live out those moral norms, rules, and obligations we've set for ourselves, um, to the best of our abilities, and not feel like we're being, and that's a hard thing to say, not feel like you're being judged because somebody else makes some kind of comment or points to something, and kind of like, well, did you, didn't you, etc. That is really where, when we look at vocation and we look at our lives and we look at the idea that we, um, as human beings, are trying to be people who live a good life and a happy life, that comes from that spark within us, that you want to call that presence of God, your soul, whatever, that innate core of humanity that makes up each individual, that we refresh that from time to time by recognizing we do good every day. And it may be quote unquote minuscule on the scale of how people look at things. But if that minuscule good doesn't get done, somebody doesn't benefit from it. And if you start looking at the fact that if almost 8 billion people on the planet don't do those minuscule little good things, it starts to take on a scope of how, um, further we could make the world a less good or happy place. And that's something that we need to recognize is part of who we are. It's part of our vocation. It's part of those moral norms, laws, and rules and obligations that we follow. That we are those little things that we do are invaluable because they compound with the next person who does it, and they turn around and do some quote unquote minuscule little good for somebody. That it snowballs, and that snowball effect doesn't ever stop. It's when humanity as a whole starts to pull back or starts to feel like, well, it's not worth it. That I'm too tired. I'm too this. I'm too that. That's when we as individuals have to recognize that it's always worth it to make that effort. Okay. Um, with that being said, the very last part of the chapter then looks at, um, vocations to the priesthood. The chapter then kind of breaks down how, their primary function is people who administer, and I'm talking about priests, administer the sacraments and conduct mass for us, how those help kind of reinforce what we've talked about in chapters 7 and 8, and kind of reinforce, um, our vocation. Okay. And it's that you can read. I'm not going to break that down for you because it's relatively straightforward material that you can kind of break down and see for yourself. Um, and so that's it for this chapter. And again, as always, if you got any questions, let me know. And until the next time, have a great day.